Hey guys, what you're about to see is a series of 3 conversations I've had in the last couple of weeks as a response to Hurricane Beryl. As you know, I went there in conjunction with the UN World Oceans Day to do some listening in Bequia, part of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Lucky enough to meet Godwin Friday, and I've tried to join up a follow-up conversation with Godwin after the terrible effects that have happened from that hurricane with some thinking from Avinash Prasad on the international development side and from Lena Fuldauer from Allianz International in Germany, the insurer and reinsurer. I'm trying to get a sense of how the global community comes together to ensure resilience, even in the face of disaster, to make sure that the global community takes responsibility when local events happen that might not have happened if we didn't emit all this carbon in the first place. I hope you like it. It's either your cup of tea or it isn't, but for those that want to learn a bit about insurance, global responsibility and disaster, check it out. Hope you enjoy it, and I look forward to talking more about it.
So I have developed a position based on observation of what's happening that has annoyed the insurers. We in the region of the Caribbean had the first ever regional risk pool. It's called CRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility.
And how does it work? How does a risk pool work?
Part of the way insurance works is by trying to spread risks in various ways. And so rather than when hurricanes come through, the thinking is, yes, one country gets obliterated, but a few other countries escape. So if they're all contributing every year, then they can smooth out the payment. So every year they're making a payment and they benefit when they've had a disaster. The problem is, David, that climate is uninsurable. There are 2 fundamental types of insurance. There's casualty, which is like disaster, your home burning down, your car insurance. And then there's life insurance, which is something you pay for many, many years and you get a big payout if you pass away. And it's not dissimilar from pensions. Casualty insurance is renewable every year. So when you ask the insurers, is it insurable? They said, oh yeah, we can insure it this year. The problem is that they won't be able to insure it in year 5, 6, or 7. And my experience is I do not want our countries to find year 7, the insurers go away at the worst possible time for the countries. Because what they need to be doing from today is the only real insurance, which is building resilience. And resilient infrastructure takes a long time to deliver. You need to do feasibility, environmental assessments, then you need to build it. It's expensive. It probably takes 5 years. So if you were to find out from 5 years from now that the insurers won't be there and then start building your seawalls and your flood defenses and your saltwater intrusion defenses, it won't be till another 5 years before you've delivered that resilience. So the more time I have, the more I can spread this risk. Climate is not like that. Climate is a known risk that's rising frequency of rising losses. So the more time I have, the more risk I have. So I can't spread across time. So then I could spread across different types of risk. I could mix, your risk with your neighbor's risk of a car accident with another person. The problem is risks that were previously uncorrelated are now becoming correlated. Barbados is a good example. In the past, a year of which we had extreme flooding would be not the year we had extreme drought. Those two things were very separate. Now we're getting both in the same year. We basically know that insurance will not be our savior. Now, I reached this conclusion 3 years ago. Allianz, AXA, a number of people got very angry with me because they were missing out on potential premiums. And they said, no, we can insure. Meaning we can insure this year. And I said, no, what's going to happen is you're going to start leaving. You're going to start raising premiums, reducing payouts. You're going to start limiting what you insure. And that's exactly what has happened. If you take California, which was never on my radar, as a good example, insurers are no longer doing fire insurance in California. They're no longer doing flood insurance in Florida. And those are places, David, which they have much skin in the game to leave those places. Come St. Vincent, half St. Vincent is not insured. They've got no real skin in the game. It's easy for them to leave St. Vincent. It won't move the needle on their profitability, revenues, or anything. So they will be quicker to leave our developing countries than they have left New York, Florida, and California. So the real insurance is building resilience. Now, we can work with the insurers to identify what is the piece of resilience we need to have that will allow the insurers to continue providing insurance. There's almost no economic activity, David, that can be done without some insurance. When you build an office block, the people financing you require you to have insurance. When you buy a house, your mortgage company requires you to have insurance. So if the insurers leave, it will actually have a systemic impact on the economies of these countries. And if they don't have an economy, they're going to have even less resources to build resilience and protect their people. So we actually want them to stay.
I guess in a way, the proper conversation with insurers begins by admitting that there are situations where they would leave, and therefore if you can admit that there are situations in the medium term, 5 to 10 years, where you would leave a place, then we can say, well, what would be the key items that we should address and should find some funding for in order, because they're good at analysing risk, aren't they? That's their business. So therefore they're good analysts for helping understand and ascertain what kind of things should we invest in to produce resilience.
So 3 years ago, they were just blanketly saying I didn't understand stuff. I pointed out to them that I had been an insurance regulator, but it was partly because many of their reinsurers are based in Northern Europe. For Germany, even if it's an uninsurable risk, if the risk was 0.1% of GDP, they can cover that. And the problem is that uninsurable risks that are big, that becomes, and for them, they weren't experiencing that. So they couldn't understand what we were talking about. The number of insurable assets in developing countries that have become uninsurable is actually quite small. The reason why it's a problem is because people are trying to use insurance as a future solution. And so one of the things we've had to say is, no, they can't provide that solution, but they can work with us on providing the real solution, which is the resilience.
Just by way of a recap, the bit you're referring to was profound when you gave me my first lesson a couple of years ago, which was that although we see in the news a lot in the West, the floods in Germany at the time, that had affected only 0.1% of the GDP, whereas Maria's effect on Dominica was, if I remember right, in 4 hours it wiped out more than 200%, so 2 years worth of GDP.
Yeah, 226.
And that level of, so that was all theoretical to me at the time. I was sitting in Glasgow at COP26, but then more recently I went, as you know, touched down very briefly in Barbados and then hopped over to St. Vincent and then ferried across to Bequia, island of 5,000 people, able to then talk with Godwin Friday, which was really interesting. But then tragically, this Hurricane Beryl came through 2 weeks later, and the reports I've read say that sort of 90% of the homes have been knocked out in Union, in Mairu, in these little islands that I had visited. And I remember talking with Godwin Friday about, are these homes insured, and who's going to pay the price for this devastation? And I guess the other question, which I might be skipping over slightly, and I wonder what your view is on it, these incidents, are they obviously directly linked to climate change, or is it sort of statistically ambiguous as to whether this is just the way it works, it happens from time to time and this is unlucky, or actually it's obviously statistically correlated in a way that it wouldn't have used to have been 20 years ago, and therefore maybe the who should pay out to rebuild those homes should be global responsibility. I
mean, let's begin with the interesting one. Can we actually say that Beryl was caused by the Industrial Revolution of the past 200 years, and therefore Britain and America and others should be contributing? So we can be very firm, like we can on climate change, that collectively the increase of risk is related to the Industrial Revolution. But we cannot say for each individual storm that ferocity was directly linked. Now, what's happening is the sea levels are getting warmer. So most of these hurricanes, if you like, they're seeded off the west coast of Africa. And as they come across the Atlantic, the warming of the sea and the dynamic of the warm sea and the warm air is contributing. They're not contributing, one for one. And then they're also changing some of the patterns. So Barbados, between 1955 and 2005, 50 years, didn't have any hurricanes. And then in the last 20, we've brushed 1, 2, 3, 4, we've had about 5 that have either come across us or very close by. So the patterns themselves are changing. So normally we are too far south. I think we can be clear that the increased intensity and frequency, which is directly connected to insurance, is climate change related, but we cannot account for each individual storm. Who should pay and how should they pay? I think of that in terms of the resilience is expensive. Not all, but especially around water, floods, sea levels, very expensive. Heat is actually slightly less expensive. You can paint your roof white and you'll have an impact. Plant trees, you can do solar powered air conditioning and you can have an impact. But flood drainage, sea walls are very expensive. And so the countries are not doing enough because they haven't got the money to do it. And there was something you were saying which triggered this other thought. When hurricane, I forget which one it was, Ivan, went across the Caribbean, caused immense destruction, came to Caymans. Actually, Cayman was almost entirely underwater. It's only 20 feet is the highest point in Cayman.
Wow.
And the loss in Cayman was near zero. And the difference was quality of building. Climate change is merely another window onto the same problem of inequality. The reason why these homes are shattered is, yes, the storm is bad, but it's also because the homes are cheap and they're poor people living in vulnerable places. And I get my European friends come over and they say, oh, yes, because you don't have proper building codes. And I say to them, okay, but you know what? If we had proper building codes, what will happen is these poor people will find places that we can't see them anymore. Because they can't afford the building codes. When Maria shredded the rainforest of Dominica, it revealed communities nobody knew were there. It was amazing. Oh, wow. There were huge communities of Rastafarians living in the jungle that no one could see, and they were living quite peacefully, doing their own thing, completely off the radar. And yes, the homes that flooded were on dry riverbeds that were previously dry, but they're there because that's the cheapest place to build. So we need to have money to build proper resilience. And the governments don't have the fiscal space. So what we have to do and what we're pushing for today is super long-term borrowing so they can pay back over 50 years. Because if I build a seawall, it costs a lot of money. But if I build it well, it will last for 50 years. You go to parts of Guyana, if you were in the Caribbean, and the Dutch built the seawall there 100 years ago. So if I can repay my loan over 50 years, it makes a huge difference. And then I need to go to the countries that contributed to climate change and say to them, I'm going to do my bit by borrowing to build resilience. Can you help me pay the interest? If you're concerned about climate change, I'm not asking you for the $100 million for the seawall, but the $5 million a year I have to pay on interest is a problem for me. Can you pay half of that? So we're doing something called IDB Klima, where we call it rewards for results. If my seawall works, can donors come in and pay half the interest? So they're only paying money when success has already been guaranteed for the money they're putting in.
When I speak to Dr. Friday, who's seeking to, after 20 years, try and bring his party into power in the St. Vincent and the Grenadines, what is it that you think he should be asking for, pushing for, from the global community or from the wider community of our planet in order to, bring about the best conditions over a 50-year period for his territory?
Climate vulnerable countries like St. Vincent, they need help in financing their resilience. So they will, be responsible and make themselves resilient. There's something else they need. They need grants when loss and damage happens. Yeah. Because when homes are destroyed, if you have to borrow money to rebuild the home, then you are going to sink under oceans of debt very quickly. Borrow the money to build something that makes you resilient and saves you money in the future, but be offered grants from the global community for destruction. And one of the things we did over the past couple of years is create the loss and damage fund. And the danger is that's where we are today. We really do need to get this fund funded. It's a great step forward that we have a fund, but it only has about $700 million in it. It needs to have $100 billion per year at a minimum. How do you get that kind of money? Well, if there was $100 per ton of carbon emitted by the shipping industry, you'd get to $100 billion. If there was a few dollars on the tons of carbon emitted by the aviation industry, you'd get another 50-odd billion. The Brazil proposed tax on the ultra wealthy, the billionaires, a 3% tax. That will raise even far more than any of those two things. So we need to fund loss and damage, and we need new innovative ways to do that.
Who's the people that are meant to be filling this fund?
The 700 million was put in by governments. European governments were contributors. Italy, France, Germany put in about $100 million each. The UK, I think their phrase was up to 60. I teased them mercilessly on the up to business. And America spent most time talking in the meeting, but only put in about 17 million.
Will any of that, for example, go to Beryl and go to St. Vincent and such?
Yes. But it's not enough. I mean, the total cost of that one storm would probably take up a third of that. And that's one storm in a place with very few people. What about if that cyclone was in a hugely populated place in Indonesia? We need new tax revenues. There is a task force that has been established by Barbados, France, and Brazil, I think. And I think we need to think about taxes on shipping and aviation, on financial transactions, to raise the $100 billion a year we need. And I think if you ask for money from other people for everything, they're going to legitimately say, look, my life's tough as well. And so you have to, I think, show responsibility. So I think the developing world pitch is we will build resilience to the thing that you caused. We will borrow the money. You need to make it easy for us to pay this back over the long term. But we can't borrow the money for the loss and damage that's happening. We need support for that. Yeah,
it's a sandwich. So it's like, we'll build the seawall in the middle, the resilient 50-year bit. When we get smashed in the short term, help us build the homes and don't hurt us on the interest over that long period as well. We'll do the bit in the middle, just you do the sandwich on either side. Because I see what you mean, you've got to have skin in the game as such. Avinash, thank you so much for making time to talk with me today as we're trying to piece together what on earth is going on. So many big themes we touch on very quickly, but I always appreciate your eloquence and preciseness, conciseness, and the detail and the education really that you give me in these half hours of power. Hopefully we'll speak again in the not too distant future. Okay, Dr. Godwin Friday, it's great to see your face and to speak again, but I'm sorry that it's in such difficult circumstances. How are you doing after Beryl hit?
Well, I mean, I'm doing fine. It's been a very, very hectic time, as you know. Hurricane Beryl hit St. Vincent and the Grenadines on the 1st of July. You know, an experience that I don't think anyone alive had ever had in this country. And so it was terrible, to say the least. You know, I was here at home in Bequia and waiting. The morning seemed quiet and normal, and then the wind started just gradually picking up and so forth. And by 9:30, 10 o'clock, it was completely different situation, you know, and completely turmoil. The wind was howling, the trees were just dancing all about the place, and, you know, you're hoping for the best and fearing the worst. But anyway, we managed up here where I am. Some people, their homes were damaged, destroyed. And of course, in the southern Grenadines, it was just catastrophic.
Sorry to hear that. And, you know, obviously when we spoke only 6 weeks ago, it was maybe just 2 or 3 weeks before all of that happened. It was just really hard to get my head around, really. A place that had always seemed so far away, then all of a sudden seemed very close. And,
yes.
And what I've read, and maybe you can tell me if this is true or if this is the news doing its thing, but I've read that 2 of the islands, Mairu and Union, that I had visited, have had something like 90% of the homes destroyed. Is there truth in that, or is that
destroyed or damaged?
Okay.
Worst hit, Mairu and Canawan, both very, very badly damaged. Union Island is, easily 90% more of the homes were damaged or destroyed. There were very few buildings that were, totally intact, unaffected.
So what happens next? Are people then homeless, or they live on the floors of their families' houses?
Immediately, of course. The first thing, and I've heard many of the stories because I went there. The hurricane took place on the Monday, Saturday, Monday morning. We had no ferry service, of course, because the ferries had all gone to other islands, to Trinidad and to Martinique for shelter. And they came back on Tuesday afternoon, and then on Wednesday we had some bad weather again, heavy rain, so they didn't work. On Thursday they worked, so I went down to southern Grenadines on the first opportunity to see the situation in Union Island. Even having seen clips and heard some stories, I was still not prepared for the level of devastation that coming off the boat that you witnessed. And they hadn't started any cleanup or anything yet. Well, they had pushed stuff out of the road, so you could drive, but they were all off to the side. And it's just everything in Clifton, which is the main harbor, was damaged, destroyed. Buildings, the sides of the walls collapsed and so forth. And a good friend of mine lost his entire business. The building itself was badly damaged, may have to be completely torn down. There's no hyperbole, there's no exaggeration. This is serious damage.
And forgive me if this sounds insensitive, but has anyone or many people lost their lives in the process?
Yes, on Union Island, I think the count is about 5 persons that they're attributing to the hurricane. Of course, there was a motor vessel, the MV Guidance 2, which is from Canawan, was blown out to sea, and with 5 members of the crew and captain on board, and we haven't heard from them since. We've had a tragic loss of life, some injury, and the homes, but listening to the stories, because I was there, again, I was in Canawan on the Friday following the hurricane, like 4 days after. And just listening to the stories of persons who survived this, you realize that this could have been a lot worse than in terms of loss of life and injury. Had it happened at night, certainly there would have been, but luckily it was in the daytime. You could see, even though you couldn't get out. But some of the stories are just horrific, and you say, thank God, this has really been as terrible as it was. In the sense, it was merciful because so many people could have lost their lives.
Maybe we'll come back to talk about your friend's business as an example of what happens next. But I spoke earlier to Avinash Prasad, who's been an economic advisor to me and Motley. When I spoke with him before, he told me that although the West was spending a lot of time talking about these floods that happened in Germany a couple of years ago, it only knocked out 0.1% of GDP of Germany, whereas he told me about the Hurricane Maria in Dominica that knocked out 230% of the GDP. Obviously there's the personal trauma and difficulty that it creates in each individual life, but on a macro sort of economic scale, what kind of level of economic damage are we thinking about here?
Because we're small island developing states, you have small countries, small geographic areas, small populations, and a hurricane essentially covers the entire country. Passes over the entire country if the eye crosses over the middle of St. Vincent. It's not like one part of the country could help another part, because everybody's in the same mess. So that is part of the problem of the response and the relief effort and so forth. But then the economic impact. The entire country is impacted. You have fisherfolk damaged, farmers, crops destroyed, businesses, tourism infrastructure destroyed, damaged, seriously damaged, people's boats damaged. So it affects the economy much more severely than if you have a large landmass where you have one city that is not even touched. You think of the United States and Florida area, they have more hurricanes than us, but they are capable of responding more quickly.
In that sense then, does the Caribbean have some kind of confederated response in moments like this? Or in fact, is the whole of the region affected in such a way that no one can help each other because they're all fending for themselves?
As big as they are, the hurricanes, they don't affect all of the countries simultaneously. They may go from the Leeward Islands and then go up to affect Jamaica and Cuba and so forth, and then on to the United States or Bahamas. As a region, we are very much aware, especially in the last 10 years or so. You have Maria and Irma and Ivan, and then Ivan to terrible. And now we've had Beryl and others. It's not Lily. We've had terrible hurricanes in the past 10, 15 years. And so what is happening now is people are recognizing the severity and the frequency of severe hurricanes are increasing, and there's a link to it, to climate change. And so it's now part of the challenge that we have in the region as a whole is responding in times of disaster. So we have regional systems, the RSS, the Regional Security System, that responds in times of crisis like these, and they will send personnel to assist in the recovery effort and so forth. We have other regional bodies like the electricity companies. They have something they call CARILEC, and what they do is they go to countries when there's disaster or a need for more than the local company can provide. But the scale of the devastation, as we've had now, for example, or they had in Dominica or in Grenadines, time of Ivan, that requires a certain level of response that even for us in the region, we can't provide entirely. So it needs a global response. That is the immediate recovery. But then I think what you're talking about is the longer term, the economic impact. How do we get back? If the value of your GDP, the damage exceeds that, then you know that you have catastrophic physical and economic damage. And so the question is, how do we recover from that? And who has the willingness and obligation even to assist in that recovery? And that's something we could talk about.
If indeed the regularity and severity of these hurricanes is increasing because of the carbon emissions and the rising temperature of the sea, then indeed the country I'm from, America, the West, is culpable, is responsible for producing that, and therefore should be somewhat responsible in the relief and recovery of what happens to rebuild people's homes and businesses. Not just in the immediate UN relief work in a kind of NGO way, but in a truly, I don't want to call it insurance, because I've understood today from Avinash that the problem with insurance is it's short-term thinking. Casualty insurance is only 1 year at a time, and then they might stop with the insurance. But who's going to rebuild those homes and who's going to pay for that? And I wonder if any American funds, Western funds, English funds currently will flow into rebuilding the homes that have been devastated.
Had, offers of assistance from various multilateral agencies and, of course, from other countries, friendly countries, small amounts, even in countries here in the region, would donate $1 million here and there and so forth. We know that this is a matter of gesture of solidarity more than anything else, to say, well, listen, we want you to know that we're thinking of you, and whatever little we can.
That's like sending flowers, though, isn't it? It's like sending flowers to say...
Well, I mean, for the small countries in the region, they're giving what they can. But I'm thinking here, in terms of, we have to go beyond just hoping that somebody will respond generously. It has to go to the level of obligation. For years, you have, the COP conferences where we are talking about global responsibility for reducing the carbon emissions and combating climate change. We all have that responsibility. It's in our own self-interest to do so. But we are at a point now where the effects are already very severe. And so what obligation is there now for those countries who says, listen, this is a global problem? It's also, in the response, it must be a global responsibility. And so we have this obligation to help those countries that are disproportionately affected and have very little capacity to respond effectively to it, and do it not just as a matter of charity or some sort of ad hoc response, but as I say, an obligation, as a standard that we say this is how we deal with climate change, by reducing the impact in the future, by reducing emissions now. But the impact is real now, so we have to also mitigate the after effects of it. And Partly it has to do with economic programs to help countries to respond, to get their economies back up, but also to rebuild better so that we have greater resilience built into our infrastructure, our homes, our coastlines, all of these things to help to mitigate the damage of hurricanes that have been made worse by climate change.
I'm glad you said resilience, because what Avinash said to me today was the way he sees it is affected nations should be the ones putting forward plans for 50-year resilience building solutions, like putting water walls to protect flooding. What the global community should be doing is, one, making sure the finance for those 50-year programs is interest-free or very cheap interest, so subsidizing the interest on that so that you're not getting burned on one side, and ensuring that when events hit like Beryl, that the sufficient support at the right level comes in so as not to distract the on-the-ground finance that you have within the nation away from the generational thinking, the 50-year thinking, and building quality resilience. Because no one wants to put their hand in the pocket if the nation in question is not doing something, but you don't want them to be distracted doing stuff they shouldn't be doing.
Obviously, I mean, it's our country. We have a responsibility to protect ourselves. We have a duty to also to plan for disasters and to enhance our ability to respond as much as possible. But when you get struck by a category 4 or 5 hurricane, the response of the country is limited because everything is affected. The threshold that has to be crossed now is to say that it is not just a charitable response. You know, we're all human beings here. You know, you've been hit with disaster, therefore we're reaching out to you. But that as a global community, we say this is a global problem. The global solution involves 2 things. 1, mitigation of the problem going forward, and also mitigation of the impact of it now to those countries, especially countries like ours with a very small carbon footprint, who are right in the path of one of the most damaging consequences of global warming and climate change. And so, to me, it seems a fairly strong argument from a point of view of global responsibility. It's an even stronger argument from the point of view of human fairness, understanding of our condition here and responding in a genuinely humanistic way. It's also a responsibility of the global community to look at the impact overall and to see how we can minimize them and respond to them immediately and in the longer term. Various politicians have been raising that. They've been doing it now for a number of years, but have not really got the kind of response that we hope for.
Because I was tempted to, point people towards somewhere that they can make a donation to support. But in a way, as you say, this can just like point their attention in the wrong direction, because this, if it was a local problem with a local solution, that's one thing. But because it's a globally caused problem, therefore the response needs to be different. And for me, for example, we got a new government in the UK with Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. I don't know them very well. I'm not in the Labour Party, but I have been at one dinner with him before. I've met some people from the party. So I can ask the question simply, what is our response based on our footprint, on our contribution to the frequency and the intensity of these hurricanes? What is our UK response so far to contributing to the rebuilding of the homes? And I think that's a perfectly fair and good question to ask, and I would expect to get some kind of an answer, and I expect the answer to be 0, which is unacceptable essentially. So
I hope not. You know, part of the challenge we have in the Caribbean is that they see us as sort of in an income bracket that doesn't qualify us for the lowest interest concessional financing. That model has to change, because in the case of a crisis like this, a disaster, it puts us back. The scientists have told us we should believe their analysis and their findings, that this is related to climate change. We know the causes of it. We have conferences every year, and we're very motivated to deal with this. So how can you say that this is the cause, but those persons who are now being, or those countries who are now being disproportionately affected, you're on your own? It can't be that way. The international community has, I believe, that obligation, and the push that we've been doing here, certainly in the Caribbean, and I think other smaller and developing states in the Pacific, is to seek to get that recognition. This is why I said earlier on that the first thing we have to do is cross that threshold to say that we are responding not just out of the kindness of our heart, but because we create the problem by our own actions. I'm not ascribing any malicious intent to anybody. People are just trying to live and to develop their economies and so forth. But you raised a question, Dave, about persons who we encourage to help, to donate, and so forth. There's nothing wrong with that, and we need it, because, I mean, if you're on a sinking ship, because they didn't prepare it properly before it set sail, in the water, you still want somebody to throw your life raft. You don't say, well, let's let the captain or the owner of the vessel and so forth take the responsibility. The point is that we have immediate needs, and we urge the international community of friends, individuals, to contribute. And as I've been saying to people, because a number of persons have reached out to me as to how can we assist, and we know immediately in the aftermath people are moved to send food and clothing and water and and so forth. But then we have the medium term, cleaning up and getting back into your homes, and then the recovery phase, which is to putting on your roof permanently, not just a temporary fix that doesn't even prevent the rainwater. It just helps to reduce it, and you can start cleaning up and rebuilding, and then you plan, say, okay, over the next 2 months, I'll plan to remove the roof entirely and repair it properly, and then do it in a way that make it stronger for the next hurricane when it comes, because we expect that it will come. This is predicted to be a very active hurricane season in the Caribbean this year, and so we have to prepare for it as well.
What might be an example of one or two places that somebody could go to if they want to contribute something or be part of helping in it?
Let me start by saying, first of all, for me, you know who I am. I'm a political figure. I'm the president of the New Democratic Party and the leader of the opposition. So, of course, we have our own means of leveraging funds and support and materials and so forth that we get to people. We did that during the volcanic eruption, and we're doing it now during Beryl. You find the organization. If you are part of a church organization and you have connections with them and you feel comfortable working through them, that is fine. The main thing is don't have your concern about, having perfect relations with somebody who is going to execute perfectly on your behalf be an obstacle for sending contributions. So do so. Find who you're comfortable with. My organization, we've stuff up. You can check on websites online. And after this, I'll send you a connection to a GoFundMe page that we've set up. But that's just one organization. There are other organizations here in the country, NGOs, that people can reach out to. As I said, find your comfortable. There are persons, government to government. They're sent to the government here. And our job as part of the system of government is to keep them responsible in making sure that this stuff gets to the people who are affected, and it's done in a timely manner. And that's been part of the challenge that we have now, to get the resources to the people who have been affected, and to do so as quickly as possible. When your home is damaged, that is your most personal thing. That's your castle. And the instinct almost is to get back in there to try and make tidy the thing that has ripped your life apart. It's just a human instinct. You want to get back there. If your bed mattress is wet, you have to throw it out. You throw it out. There's a smell in the house that is foul. You want to clean that up because that's your home, and you want to get back there as quickly as possible.
If you add up the resources from the government, some donations that come in, international multilateral organizations that have contributed something, if you look at the whole pie of how much it would cost to just deploy the funds to everybody that needs them in order to get their homes back to where they were, how much do you think of that overall amount that's required might have...
On the 18th of July, we had a meeting and voted $136.4 million, that's EC dollars, for the recovery. But the expectation is that is just what is available now, but that is going to require quite a lot more than that. Especially in the longer term. This is for cleanup, for immediate response, and for also including repairs to government infrastructure. In schools, for example, the roofs were blown off. Those have to be repaired. In Canawan and Bequia, 2 of the schools in Bequia, the roof were blown off. The response would be 2 or 3 times as much as that.
It's a pleasure to talk with you again. I appreciate you taking the effort to talk with me, and I hope one way or another that effort will become useful and helpful in some way in your country. How, I don't know. I just know that I can do what I can do, which is talk with you, and I can create the content, and I can represent what I think is hopefully a fair position in terms of sharing that responsibility with those that generated the problem, which is me coming from my place as well. But I guess the one last thought is just, is there anything else that you want to share on this matter that, you know, I'm missing that's like an important point?
Well, importantly is that what I want to say thanks, to be honest, to those persons, countries, agencies, individuals who have contributed. In the first few days after the hurricane, of course, you want to get people in their home, get in shelters, and get food for them and make sure that they have a regular supply and to take care of their hygiene, their security, and so on. Also down the road, the kids have to go back to school. At some point, you know, in September, school starts here. It may be delayed in the southern Grenadines. I don't know, because people want to be able to rebuild there and to go back to school there. We have set up a fund, a bursary, and this is what the GoFundMe is partly for, to raise funds essentially to give bursaries to kids as they return to school. And that is something that we hope to get some support for, so we could help in that respect, because it's something that most people think about immediately now, but it's obviously something that will be confronted, because parents, they're concerned about getting a roof over their head, getting back a furniture, buying something. They're not going to wait for government to do it, and people are spending money. Their relatives abroad are sending money for them to help to repair their roof and so forth on a temporary basis. So that money would have been helping to prepare for school. Now they have to, and I know that there are other agencies doing likewise, you know, to help to people to go back to school, set up for helping elderly persons and for helping persons to get, you know, furniture and appliances back in their homes, so that they could resume as much of a normal life as possible. The next part of it, of course, to be able to get the economy going so that they could return to being productive, getting a salary, getting paid, so that they could provide for themselves in the longer term. That's going to take a little bit more time.
And then I guess to come full circle, to finish on your friend's business that you mentioned, how will he get that going again? Will he have to raise investment from friends? Will he have to, will he get a grant? Will he just not be able to start up again?
He is determined. I guess is the other point I wanted to make when I started out, when I said thanks to people. But the other one is to assure you of the resilience of the people. You know, people are, it's amazing. You talk to people who have been through hell, and what they look at you, they said, you know, Friday, he said, I'm so glad to be alive. He said, I'm ready to rebuild, and we will do it, and we will take whatever help we can get, but we know it's our homes, and so it's our businesses, and we have the primary responsibility to get it done. So you know that people are going to be doing it. My friend, he took a great loss, a great hit, and it affected him, you know, tremendously in terms of the psychological impact of it. But, you know, it's been a month on, and he's determined now and planning to find ways in which to reconstruct his business. And I know other persons in the communities in Union Island, Myro, and, here in Beckwith, that they're doing likewise. And so my thing, though, is that for us to get the assistance, for government in particular, to get the assistance as quickly as possible. Those channels you're talking about, how does he get it? All kinds of means, you know, privately, friends, but also the responsibility of the government to assist persons in this recovery effort. We voted money in the parliament for that, so they have to be able now to tell people, this is how you access this is how you qualify, this is how much that you would get, so that they can plan going forward. And I hope to see that happen yesterday.
I'm glad to hear about the irrepressible human spirit, because that is at the heart of it, isn't it? If you've got some
remarkable
fight and some spirit, many magical, creative, wonderful things can happen in communities. So
the real hope, and that is why I believe that those communities that were worst affected, they will recover quicker than people expect and better than we expect. But it requires all of us to pitch in to give them a hand.
So Friday, thanks as ever for doing what you do and going around and talking to people and being willing to talk with me. As ever, I hope you carry on well with your party and with your campaign, and hoping and wanting the best for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and hope to continue to be a part of a drop in your ocean of your story. And let's see what happens next. Thank you.
And thanks for taking the time for doing this. I'm really grateful. It will help.
It's my pleasure. All right. Lena, thank you so much for joining me for these conversations about the ocean and climate. And I don't really know exactly how we're putting it all together, but I wanted to get some different voices who have some different things to say.
That's great. And thank you so much, David. Great to see you again. So I joined Allianz around 3 years ago. after I finalized my PhD, so focusing mainly there on climate risks and understanding climate risk on infrastructure and its potential impact on sustainable development, especially the UN SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals. I was fascinated really by the insurance industry's role in incentivizing resilience, which of course, with increasing climate impacts, it's going to become an ever increasing important topic. And I felt that the insurance industry, in my view, is really the only for-profit industry that has a direct benefit of investing in resilience, because it can help reduce damages and keep high-risk areas in the long term insurable. And I was really lucky because Allianz Commercial created a new department last year called Sustainability Solutions. And our mandate is to develop new solutions for our commercial customers in the space of sustainability.
This term incentivizing resilience obviously sits right at the heart of economics, finance, and something to do with ecology or ability to manage risk on the ground, shall we say. But before we come into defining that kind of crosshair, if you like, could you give just a one-liner on what fundamentally insurance is and what reinsurance is?
Insurance really is a financial protection mechanism where it is possible to pay a monthly premium, which is usually much more affordable, to be able to protect oneself, whether that is your own home, your health, your commercial business, against extremes that if they happen to you, you might not be able to afford it, you might be bankrupt, you might get in trouble, basically.
And Allianz is in the business of doing that for everything from big to small all over the world?
Does the majority. So we have both health insurance, we have property insurance, motor insurance, commercial insurance. So what exactly is offered does depend on each country. So we do have different operating entities, we call it. So there's an Allianz Germany, an Allianz Italy, Allianz Spain, etc., and then an Allianz Commercial, which is where I'm based, and that's global.
What's reinsurance then?
So reinsurance is actually very easily explained because they are the insurer of the insurer. An insurer could go bankrupt because if one big event happens, let's say in Germany, there's a really, really, really bad tropical cyclone that destroys the majority of the insured objects. And they need to make sure that they can pay out the claims, right, from everyone. In order to be able to ensure that even in the worst case scenario of all the potential events happening at the same time, they are able to pay back. Yes. So they actually go to the market, and in the same way that I would buy insurance for my house or for my car or for my own business that I'm running, insurers buy insurance from reinsurer.
And one last question on reinsurance. Are there reinsurers of reinsurers?
Yain. So usually you share the risk. For example, in commercial business, it's not just one company that insures a commercial property, but you have lead insurers. So they would take the majority of the risk, and then it's shared by different ones. And then they all buy reinsurance. In the case of Allianz Reinsurance, we insure all the Allianz entities, but then we go and buy reinsurance on the external reinsurance market. Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's really helpful. So then let's go back to this incentivizing resilience. We've heard about resilience on the other two conversations I've had with Avinash Prasad and with Godwin Friday. What are you defining resilience as? And then I'd love to hear an example of what you mean by incentivizing resilience.
Being able to adapt your objects, your people to the increasing physical impacts of climate change. So that can be increased floods, increased frequency or severity of wildfires. So to be able to change your processes to be able to deal with that increased risk.
And in what way are you able to incentivize those kind of resilient protection actions that people can take?
So I think as an industry, we have a number of direct and more indirect levers to support or incentivize mainly our clients to take up resilience measures. The very indirect ones we have is, of course, we can create awareness, right? So we can tell our clients after they've had a claim to say, well, actually, you're particularly exposed. Climate risk is potentially increasing in that particular area. Be aware of it. Here are some checklists, some measures that you can take to help improve your resilience.
That's in your interest, because the more people that you insure against something, the fewer you want to claim, because the fewer that claim, the better the business runs for you. If everybody claims on something you've insured, you might stop insuring that, or struggle to make it work business wise.
Yes, so I become uninsurable because people cannot pay it anymore. So one of the worries with climate change is that insurers, to basically reflect the increase in risk into the future, that they will have to increase premiums, and that people won't be able to pay for that anymore because it's just too expensive, and then don't buy insurance at all, which is bad for everyone, really. Because, of course, in the end of the day, a lot of the times, in a lot of countries, the government steps in and they don't necessarily have the funds either to pay. For the insurers, we lose customers. The individual loses its financial protection. No one wants to have their house destroyed.
Is it debated, or is it clear that these events are at least substantially correlated to climate change?
Depends a lot on what scale you look at. So at an individual event level, you can use what is called attribution science. So it's a method used by climate scientists where they basically run climate models in climate that did not have human-induced CO2 emissions, and one in which there were the ones that we're seeing right now, to understand how did the probability of that particular event change because of climate change.
And is the event in this case the whole of Beryl, or is it like one building being struck by Beryl?
Specific flood or the particular wildfire. So it's an actual, let's say, natural peril, natural catastrophe.
Okay.
You zoom out and you take, let's say, more of an insurance perspective, and we look at our own data and we look at claims over time and losses over time. We are seeing a huge increase in natural catastrophe losses. However, what we are seeing is that the majority and the dominant factor of that increase in losses is due to socioeconomic factors. So that is building in highly exposed areas, reducing the amount of soil where, for example, in the case of flooding, water can actually be absorbed because one has built infrastructure, one has built concrete roads, etc. And of course, from an insurance perspective, just an increase in asset value. So the more asset value there is globally, the more insured losses.
Oh, so overall global development means there's more assets to insure and then more losses to be had. If a field gets flooded that nobody's using, unless you're a nature scientist who's looking at how much nature was there and now it's lost, no one's particularly paying close attention, or not as close as they would if it was their house anyway.
And then there's the socioeconomic factors, of course, actually building in highly exposed areas, factors such as shortened rivers to optimize transport routes. So, of course, over the past decades, a lot of the rivers have been straightened in order to make ships and freight, etc., operations more efficient. From a flooding perspective, of course, that means that the risk of flooding increases. So not all is climate change. And I think it's actually very important. And I think it's our responsibility, coming more again, having my academic hat on, is to really say not everything is becoming worse because of climate change. Speaking as a non-insurance person or Allianz person, personal view, I think that 100% we need to support vulnerable countries. And I think there's a lot already happening as well. So to not forget that there are international organizations. So I was really lucky to be able to work before I joined Allianz a lot with the UN. So they are doing work to support vulnerable countries, especially the most vulnerable countries, to really identify which adaptation or resilience measures are most relevant and then help them to apply to some of those funds available for them. I mean, now speaking from an insurance perspective, I think there are mechanisms by which insurance can play a role in supporting or incentivizing resilience. So just to take an example, quite an interesting pilot in east coast of Mexico, where different coastal property owners all pay into a fund. So it's all the actual firms. So it might be an infrastructure that is close to the coast because they are needing the transport. It can be hotel chains. It can be whatever. Coastal properties that all pay into a fund. That fund pays for insurance to the natural areas that help protect that coastline already. So in the case of this east coast of Mexico, of the coast of Cancun around there, there's a reef basically, which of course also helps reduce the risk of tropical cyclones.
Yeah.
And this pilot, what it does is, in case a tropical cyclone actually destroys part of the reef, thereby, of course, one, reducing the value, the ecosystem services that that reef provides to the society there, but also to the ocean. It protects that. And in case natural event destroys part of it, the insurance pays for the restoration and the conservation efforts needed to rebuild that nature-based infrastructure.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a more indirect means by which to answer your question. But I think it's quite an interesting one because one could apply that bigger scale to say, okay, how can we actually have much more of these nature-based solutions are both a carbon sequestration. So they actually also take in CO2 emissions. And a lot of the companies are buying carbon offsets to, for example, invest in some of these carbon sequestration potentials. The insurance can then now, for example, also insure against the potential that the CO2 emissions are not reduced in the way that was expected because there's a natural catastrophe. Yeah. Insurance can again play a role by having that financial mechanism to really scale up and to give security to a lot of these projects that then companies who are investing in, for example, carbon offsets, know that they're not going to be sued by on greenwashing or others because their projects they've invested in have actually not achieved the value. So I think there is insurance linked in a lot of those, but I think it means kind of thinking outside of the box and really piloting initiatives.
To collectivize together, to buy insurance against that nature or for that nature, so that if it gets hit, they are able to restore it. I guess the basis for that is that they are aware at the beginning of how much value it produces for them. Are you in Allianz doing nature insurance?
Not yet.
Yeah. Because a lot of the value would come from the perception of value that comes through credit, which in itself is also a developing economy. It's not like a well-established, stable economy, you know.
I do think there's one more emerging topic is that there's more and more nature regulation. So we've seen the task force for climate-related disclosures, and there's more now on having equivalence for nature. Same with a lot of the ESG regulations where you have to disclose your climate impact. We are expecting more risks in terms of failure to look at nature in construction projects, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think the industry, and when you look at the publications out there from generally the insurance industry, there is more and more interest in this topic. I think generally the industry is not quite there yet to offer full-scale solutions like they do in other products, just because, of course, for insurance, it's also important to understand the risks, as you said, and to have data.
Which is why I think it's fascinating to talk with you, because I think that there's a lot of people who have a lot of views about climate risk, climate responsibility, but they don't have skin in the game. Whereas what I still am learning about, let's say, the ethics or the overall like impact of having insurance or not having insurance, or what it means to be a good insurance company versus a bad insurance company. And I don't know if those two things exist either, but I can see how at least you can say that an insurer has skin in the game, has had to seriously think about what is the likelihood of something happening, and then try to find what they think is an appropriate margin on top of that risk in order to operate.
And that's what I meant at the very start, where I do think we have quite a direct lever as an insurance company, is of course right after the claim. So imagine your home now is destroyed because of a flood, and you have insurance with an insurance company. Then if directly whilst you're going through, okay, what am I going to rebuild? Do I really need my oil, whatever heater in the basement? Do I really need this specific flooring if I know I'm in a high risk area? Your insurer can directly tell you at that stage, well, dear Dave, please don't do 1, 2, 3. And maybe we can help incentivize you in some way. And there is examples of that happening in the insurance industry where you say, for example, if you build back more CO2 friendly, whatever, we will support you by...
That makes a lot of sense, actually. Is there something, is it this nature insurance concept? Is that an emerging thing that we should be thinking about? Or what could I share back with Godwin that would be interesting for him to consider?
I think the first step is really looking at climate risk on a national scale basis. And I would prefer quite a lot here to the methodologies developed in Oxford, where I've done my PhD, and the group has done really a very interesting job and great work in terms of looking at understanding the risk across different perils on national infrastructure, and especially then looking at its interdependencies, and I'll get to that in a second. But I think the first step is very much collecting the evidence of where risk in a particular country is highest from different perils to really make decisions on where to prioritize adaptation, on resilience measures, whether that's nature-based solutions or what you mentioned early on, seawalls, etc. But where are those most needed? Because no country has all the money in the world. Mm-hmm. And even if they get climate funds, etc., it's still, where is that money best? So I think it's looking, one, at where's risk highest from a hazard perspective, and then two, where is actually the potential impact highest? Of course, nature-based solutions are fantastic. They're usually lower risk, and they can help reduce impact. And why am I saying they're fantastic? Because they have multiple benefits beyond just reducing risk on assets. So, for example, in the previous work I've done, I was also looking at a Caribbean island, and they had a wetland that directly protected the critical road that is the only road linking the north and south of the island. Basically not destroying that wetland to build something there has a value much bigger than than the actual, let's say, potential opportunity cost of building whatever a different hotel or business in that area. How could nature either be a full resilience solution or could help support another physical based solution? So it might be a seawall, or it might be adapting the actual building, as you mentioned, with different building materials, etc. So it could also, nature can also have a support function to help reduce the cost of actual physical infrastructure.
In order to appropriately understand the value of the ecology, you probably have to have quite a good sense of understanding of the ecosystem services they're providing in order to even perceive that they're valuable in the first place. If you don't have that perception, you probably wouldn't look to value it or to protect it. Okay.
Exactly. For example, one bit of my PhD was looking at exactly that. So what I mentioned earlier in terms of measuring the impact of a critical infrastructure such as a port could be measured, for example, by the amount of freight coming into that port, or the amount of passengers coming into that port, or some kind of indicator measurement that allows to understand the importance of that infrastructure. And one could apply the same thinking to nature's. How can we measure the ecosystem services? Of course, that's way more difficult to at least start to think, okay, what is the potential value being protected in the surrounding area? Is there a tourism value? How can we potentially put a price tag on that? And that then goes into a lot of further methodologies. How do we even value nature and value the ecosystem services they provide, and getting an assessment at a national scale of that?
I totally agree with that, and I would love to ask Godwin where they're at with that now. They may already have that, and it may be, really comprehensive, or that might be news to them. In the UK, there's this place called Sussex Bay that they're establishing this brand around the south coast for 100 miles that's been designated as a no-trawl zone. And for the last 4 years, it's been rewilding. The merle beds are coming back. It's all like really coming back to life in a beautiful way. My worry is that it would only take one big trawler once to just scan through the bottom of the seabed to decimate all of the work, and it can't be just replaced in a minute. It takes years to come back. I wonder whether if I had the right authority to do so, whether I could get to a place where I could get insurance for Sussex Bay to make sure that at least we would be able to mount a serious legal case against anybody who broke the rules and trawled in a place that they weren't meant to, so that instead of getting a few £1,000 fine and a slap on the wrist, they're actually forced to pay out millions, let's say, equivalent to the biodiversity net gain credits that they've decimated by trying to bottom trawl. I guess I'm wondering in that scenario whether that would even be possible to try and insure like 100-mile area, 100-mile stretch, 10 miles long, so like whatever that is, 1,000 miles squared. Yeah, whether that would ever be affordable, and whether it could help encourage investment in those said credits and also help deter potential trawlers from getting overexcited and going where they shouldn't go. Does that make sense?
Try and answer your question with a few questions that you can start to ask yourself.
Lovely.
Generally, I can say any insurance policy, you need to have some kind of trigger, right? So if we think about natural catastrophes, I think about your car, it's an accident happening and you actually see damage. So I think the first question to ask, what is the trigger? Like what can go wrong and how one could measure that? The second question I would ask is what kind of insurance could be particularly helpful? And that actually links to your other question that you said, anything you haven't asked me. So there's mainly two main types of insurance that we differentiate. One is indemnity-based insurance, which is what we know. So it is your car being damaged and someone looks at it and says, this is the damage it has. And then a few months later, you get your money back. As opposed to that, there is also parametric insurance.
Parametric.
So what that means is that you define a trigger. So you can, for example, define a potential amount of wind speed measured in kilometers an hour, or a potential amount of flood depth or whatever. But you define a trigger, and as soon as you can measure that trigger, so of course that means you need some kind of objective measurement, but as soon as that is reached, you have a direct payout, no matter whether or not you've had a certain claim. So it speeds up the process a lot because you don't have that claims adjuster. But of course, it doesn't always work, right? Because you need measurements, you need to be able to identify very clearly what are some of the indicators. So that would be, going back to your thought, like that would be the second question. What would you want to achieve with that insurance? And is there a way that you could define a certain parameter, a certain trigger that actually then pays out money directly? And if so, where should that money go? Should it go to conservation agencies? Who does it go to? So who's the benefiter and what is the actual event trigger and what type of trigger would make most sense in that case?
There's two different things to be insured. One is potentially the legal process of trying to like prosecute or trying to defend the trigger being the trawler, somebody coming in with the nets across the bottom of the seabed and like trying to prosecute them, let's say, successfully. That's not protecting the actual nature itself. The other is then who would you pay to actually do the work of regenerating those beds. But in the case of rewilding and in the case of Sussex Bay, there may be some work to be done, but the whole point of it is just not letting people in. And you might say that we need better protection, different version of fencing, do you know what I mean, like a different way of creating a boundary and a protection, and that might be what, I don't know, it's a good question. I'll think about it more, about what those defined boundaries would be and what we'd be looking to pay out for. But I can imagine with some form of insurance, almost any form of insurance that was meaningful, I can imagine would make it easier for people to feel their investment inside that space would be protected, help deter others from
and reduce the risk of it, right?
Yeah, exactly, reduce it from happening in the first place. Thank you so much for making a bit of time today. Is there anything else you wanted to just chuck on the table before we wind up?
Just a word of, thank you, and thanks for continuing to be an inspiration.
Well, it's always good talking with you, Lena. I appreciate it. And I'm sure this won't be the last one.